Merleau-Ponty begins his Phenomenology of perception by critiquing two dominant approaches to perception, empiricism and intellectualism. He argues that both fail to fully account for the richness of lived perceptual experience. However, rather than outright rejecting these traditions, he uses them as a springboard to guide readers toward a deeper understanding of perception. His aim is not to dismiss these perspectives entirely, but to expose their limitations and invite us to rethink perception in a more profound way. In Chapter 4 of this introduction, Merleau-Ponty shifts the focus from specific theories about perception to the reflective attitudes underlying those theories. He shows that truly understanding perception requires moving beyond the rigid frameworks of empiricism and intellectualism and embracing the ambiguity of the phenomenal field, which reframes perception as an active process embedded in relationships between self, others, and the environment. We'll then see how, through philosophical reflection, we can move from the phenomenal field into the transcendental field without losing thought's grounding in embodied perception. Finally, we'll consider how Merleau-Ponty rethinks psychology through a phenomenological lens, grounding philosophical reflection in lived experience while critiquing introspective and reductionistic approaches to mental life and consciousness. This in turn sets the stage for his broader project, a philosophy that reconnects reason with the dynamic reality of lived experience. In everyday life, a sense experience is not just about passively observing dead qualities, but about engaging with active qualities that are intertwined with our bodily existence and the world around us. For example, a wooden wheel on the ground is perceived differently than one bearing a load. A candle's light changes its meaning for a child after the child has been burned by it. These examples from Merleau-Ponty illustrate that perception is not a detached, neutral process, but one imbued with meaning and shaped by our bodily interactions with the world. He writes, "Sense experience is that vital communication with the world which makes it present as a familiar setting of our life. It is to it that the perceived object and the perceiving subject owe their thickness. It is the intentional tissue which the effort to know will try to take apart." Understanding must also be rethought in light of this view of perception. Rather than being confined to intellectual functions, understanding is spread across our entire intentional life. It emerges from both instinctive and rational layers of experience. Authentic reflection on perception must account for both its, what he calls, vital inherence and its rational intention. By vital inherence, it emphasizes that perception is rooted in our bodily existence, including those instinctual layers of our being. Our physical presence in the world shapes how we encounter and respond to it. For example, when we reach for an object, our bodies anticipate its shape and texture, demonstrating a pre-reflective understanding that is not intellectual, but deeply practical and situational. This is what Merleau-Ponty will later on call motor intentionality. That is a kind of bodily intelligence that allows us to navigate and act within the world without conscious deliberation. The other term, rational intention, refers to the capacity to generate meaning and structure. Perception is not merely about sensing, it's about interpreting and organizing what we encounter into coherent experiences. For instance, when we see a chair, we don't just perceive its physical properties. We understand it as something we can sit on because it fits into a broader context of meaning shaped by our experiences and cultural frameworks. According to Merleau-Ponty, science and philosophy have long relied on an implicit trust in perception. treating it as a window to the truth of the world. Perception is assumed to connect us to a coherent reality, where experiences across time and between individuals can align seamlessly. This belief underpins the idea that any current uncertainty or indeterminacy in perception could eventually be resolved through more complete knowledge. Science in particular builds on this faith in perception by extending its process. Just as perception organizes sensory experiences into stable objects, science seeks to fix and objectify phenomena through concepts and theories. For example, it defines forces and properties by imagining objects in perfect isolated conditions, free from external influences, and uses these abstractions to explain real-world processes. I can think about this in drawing from my experience doing psychological research, where researchers want to, for example, study depression. They use what is called an operationalized variable. In this case, depression will be defined as, say, a Beck Depression Inventory score of 12 or greater. In such a study, the researcher will speak about depression as though it's a real-world process. And when the media picks up on that research, they will talk about depression as this real living thing. But in fact, what is being referred to beneath that is a numerical cutoff defining depression. Admittedly, a necessary element of conducting empirical research, but highly problematic when it comes to generalizability, or what is sometimes called ecological validity. As such, this approach freezes being into a static system of relationships, making it seem as though reality itself can be fully captured by scientific methods. Merleau-Ponty highlights that the scientific perspective rests on an unexamined assumption that perception naturally discloses being, or the essence of things. Since perception presents itself as a direct encounter with reality, science has not felt compelled to question or investigate the origins of this sense of being. Instead, it concentrates on abstract causes, treating objects as ideal unities defined by their general properties. Even when scientists acknowledge the inherent incompleteness of our understanding of objects, an admission often made by more modest practitioners, they still assume that scientific methods are the sole valid means for defining reality. This mechanistic view extends to human experience. For example, in ordinary life, we naturally perceive meaning and coherence in gestures, expressions, and tones of voice. They reveal a person's way of being in the world. Yet, mechanistic physiology reduces these meaningful interactions to chains of causal relationships governed by physical and chemical properties. In doing so, it overlooks the deeper significance of lived experience and the dynamic interplay between perception and being. Merleau-Ponty suggests that this reductionistic approach fails to capture the richness and complexity of our embodied existence in the world. This reductionistic view, he says, transforms the body from being my body, the visible expression of my lived self, into just another object in the world, devoid of interiority. Similarly, the body of another person is no longer seen as the outward expression of their subjectivity, but as a kind of machine. Any recognition of another's consciousness becomes an abstract inference rather than a direct perception. In this way, subjectivity is stripped from the body entirely, leaving that body as an exterior without interior. Conversely, and at the same time, subjectivity itself is reduced to a detached, isolated interior without exterior, akin to an impartial observer disconnected from the world. This dualism between body and subjectivity, where the body is treated as an object and subjectivity as a purely internal phenomenon, results in a fragmented understanding of human existence. The empirical self, which is our lived experience of being both embodied and conscious in the world, becomes incoherent in this framework. Merleau-Ponty writes, "The whole concrete content of psychic states resulting according to the laws of psychophysiology and psychology, from a universal determinism, was integrated into the in itself. There was no longer any real for itself other than the thought of the scientist, which perceives the system and which alone ceases to occupy any place in it. Now, you might have noticed something in that quote if you are familiar with Sartre, and especially if you watched my analysis of his book, Being and Nothingness. There are two terms that are in that quote, the for itself and the in itself. Merleau-Ponty's critique of science in the quoted passage can also be understood as an implicit critique of Sartre's ontology. Merleau-Ponty sees Sartre's framework as perpetuating a Cartesian-style dualism by establishing an unbridgeable divide between the in itself and the for itself. This division, according to Merleau-Ponty, fails to account for the pre-reflective unity of our being in the world, emphasizing the inseparability of subjectivity, body, and world in lived experience. Nature is not inherently orderly, and human society is neither intrinsically rational nor unified. These ideals have often appeared plausible in certain historical moments, such as those marked by temporary economic or biological stability. The acknowledgement of chaos, both in theoretical reflection and lived experience, compels us to rethink the concept of reason itself. Instead of viewing reason as a timeless, universal principle, we have to understand it as something that emerges historically within a world it did not create. This perspective demands a philosophy rooted in lived experience, which serves as the essential foundation for reason to retain its meaning and vitality. Classical science, then, should be seen as a particular mode of perception, one that has lost sight of its origins in lived experience and mistakenly assumes itself to be complete. Philosophy's first task, then, is to return to the world of direct experience that precedes the objective world constructed by science. This involves restoring the richness of things as they appear to us, the unique ways we engage with our environment, the intertwined relationships between self, others, and the world. By discovering this layer of living existence, we can better understand how others and things first become meaningful to us. In light of this, Merleau-Ponty introduces the concept of the phenomenal field. It is a realm of direct experience that challenges the conventional idea of a fixed external world. It invites us to reconsider how perception operates before it is shaped or categorized by scientific theories or philosophical systems. Returning to the phenomenal field avoids the dualistic assumptions of other philosophical approaches and emphasizing perception as an active process of understanding and appropriation rather than a passive receiver of sense data, nor as merely a matter of rational reflection and judgment. The phenomenal field dissolves the strict separation between subject and object. Instead of perceiving a detached external world, we are already embedded in a relational context where our perceptions and actions are intertwined with that world. Things like faces, behaviors, or gestures are not just visual data with psychological meaning that are hidden inside of our heads. They are meaningful wholes that we perceive directly. This shift for Merleau-Ponty transforms the concept of the immediate. The immediate is no longer considered raw, isolated sense data, what the analytic philosopher Sellers called the myth of the given, but instead refers to the meaning and structure inherent in phenomena that arises from our interactions with them. Even our own mental life is given to us in this way, as an articulated, unified pattern of behavior that carries immanent meaning. As such, the phenomenal field is not an inner world or some collection of mental states accessible only through introspection. It does not reveal some mysterious or hidden inner world. Instead, it uncovers the lived experience that underpins all scientific and objective knowledge. This process runs counter to our natural tendency to focus on external objects and their results. what he calls perception's crypto mechanism. Yet, even science borrows its models from lived experience, though failing to explicitly acknowledge them. Exploring such phenomena is not some irrational leap into the unknown, but a deliberate analysis of the pre-scientific life of consciousness. This lived experience gives meaning to scientific operations and remains their foundation. By making such a foundation explicit, we then reconnect with the structures of perception that allow us to engage with the world in meaningful ways. Consciousness is not confined to describing the world as it is experienced, but must also account for how this experience gets constituted. Recognizing that all objects are known through phenomena, reflection then shifts its focus to understanding how objects are constituted through consciousness. This shift transforms the phenomenal field into a transcendental one, where consciousness is no longer just a collection of mental contents or forms, but becomes the universal center of knowledge. This move toward deeper reflection leads to the idea of a transcendental subject, a thinking ego that constitutes the self, others, and the world. Traditional transcendental philosophy assumes that such a subject can fully grasp and disclose all aspects of experience. However, Merleau-Ponty argues that this idealized view is flawed because it overlooks the inherent limitations and situatedness of reflection. Reflection is always partial, shaped by individual perspective, history, culture, and the lived world. It cannot fully escape these conditions to achieve some all-encompassing view. As such, reflection must recognize its own limits and origins. It arises from unreflective experience and transforms our understanding of existence without ever fully capturing it. Philosophy then is not about achieving an absolute or universal perspective, but about engaging in a perpetual process of beginning again. But it's rooted in individual life and experience. This makes philosophy a creative act rather than a fixed system of knowledge. Instead of striving for total clarity or unity, philosophy should remain grounded in the dynamic interplay between reflection and lived reality. Now, just as we noted a departure from Sartre earlier, we should be hearing here, while also affirming the idea of a transcendental field and transcendental subject, a departure from Husserl's transcendental phenomenology. By grounding transcendental reflection in pre-reflective embodied perception, the phenomenal field, Merleau-Ponty is attempting to reject Husserl's pursuit for universal structures of experience and the view of phenomenology as a rigorous science in the sense that Husserl meant by the term rigorous. Philosophical knowledge for Merleau-Ponty is ultimately a creative act rooted in lived reality and always situated within a particular context. And it's also here where we can begin to see how Merleau-Ponty will have an influence on some later post-structuralist thought, such as in the works of Foucault, Deleuze, and Derrida. An important distinction Merleau-Ponty makes in this chapter is between introspective psychology versus phenomenological psychology. Introspective psychology, often associated with the founding figure of experimental psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, relies on trained individuals systematically analyzing their own mental processes to understand the structures of consciousness. According to Merleau-Ponty, this approach is flawed for the same reason the scientific grounding of knowledge is flawed. In this case, introspective psychology treats consciousness as just another sector of being, much like a physicist might study a sector of the physical world, and assumes the objective world as an unquestioned framework for its investigations. It thus reduces consciousness to a mere psychic fact, something that exists within the boundaries of the objective world. And even when introspective psychology tries to move beyond physicalist concepts, such as replacing mechanical energy with spiritual or fluid forms of being, it still remains trapped in the same framework. If we try to create a psychology of perception that assumes consciousness is confined to the body and influenced by an objective external world, we will inevitably be forced into the problem of how to describe the ways in which objects in the world appear to consciousness. Phenomenological psychology, on the other hand, takes a different approach by focusing on the gestalt, that is, the way meaning and structure is holistically emerging in perception. It challenges psychologism, the reduction of mental phenomena to psychological processes. In this view, sensations are not just raw data assembled by our physiology or mental categories. Instead, their immediate and intrinsic meaning and organization shape how we perceive them. This move into psychology, even a phenomenological one, as a starting point for philosophical thought, is at first glance a surprising one for a philosopher to make. Why does Merleau-Ponty claim that the philosophical exploration of perception begins with psychological considerations? He argues that by beginning from the quote-unquote natural attitude, our everyday unreflective engagement with the world, we can methodically trace the steps that lead to deeper philosophical questions about how experience and meaning are constituted. Such an approach avoids the mistake of what he calls reflexive philosophy, and also called in the previous chapter intellectualism, which prematurely assumes a transcendental perspective as if it were already given, thereby skipping over the actual process of understanding how such a perspective emerges in the first place. As such, starting with phenomenological psychology is consistent with his move for grounding the transcendental in the lived messiness of embodied existence. However, Merleau-Ponty also emphasizes that psychology alone is not enough. While psychological descriptions help us become familiar with phenomena and revive perceptual experience, often buried under layers of interpretation, they require philosophical guidance to be fully meaningful. Philosophy then, in turn, provides the framework and perspective necessary to make sense of these psychological descriptions and reveal their deeper implications. In this way, experience inherently anticipates philosophy, and philosophy in turn clarifies and deepens our understanding of experience. Thus, we must begin with psychology, but move beyond it through what he calls second-order reflection. This reflective process examines not just phenomena, but the very act of experiencing them, what he calls the phenomenon of the phenomenon. By doing so, it transforms the phenomenal field into a transcendental one, shifting from a focus on appearances to uncovering the underlying structures that make perception possible. This marks the transition from psychological inquiry to philosophical insight. And this concludes the introduction to the phenomenology of perception. Next time, we move into part 1, where Merleau-Ponty will provide an important and influential analysis of the body. Thank you for watching till the end. And a special thank you to whoever shared this channel to what seems to be a very large group of individuals, as there was a massive influx of subscribers this week, far more than I've ever seen for this channel. And it's exciting to see the channel grow, and we're approaching 10,000, and I've got some ideas for how to mark that moment once it passes, now sooner than I expected. So thank you. And if you want to continue supporting this work, I always encourage you to like this video, share it to others, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you want to support this work financially, you can do so through the Super Thanks button here on YouTube. And you can also become a Patreon subscriber, where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, these charts that I'm using in the video, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I'd like to thank the following for already supporting this work over on Patreon. So thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.